All right, everybody. This is Alana Kaivalya, and I am here with Shawn Moore, who is a student in the Kaivalya Yoga Method and who I have been very fortunate to connect with this week in talking about what's happening with everything surrounding George Floyd and the protests and what is a very necessary and thankfully happening now change in perception, how we're living, becoming more aware of our own racial biases, fighting for racial justice and social justice. There's a lot happening this week. And many people inside the Kaivalya Yoga Method Academy this week were wondering, what do I do? How do I change myself as a result of everything that's going on? How do I support my students as a result of everything that's going on? And I don't pretend to be an expert in this. I want to be, but I thought it would be really wonderful to reach out to someone like Shawn who has some experience here and has very thankfully and warmly volunteered his time for us today to help us navigate this in the best way possible, not only as yoga teachers and yoga students, but also as spiritual leaders. People do come to us for support around this. So I want to make sure we're doing the best job that we can. So without further ado, Shawn Moore, thank you so much for being here today. And would you start actually by telling us a little bit more about you?
Sure. Thank you again for creating this space for us to have this conversation. I think it's a much needed conversation, and I'm glad that we are able to do this in this particular format.
Me too.
Yeah. So a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Shawn Moore. I would say to break down kind of the work that I do is I create sacred spaces for folks to dive in for personal discovery and self-study. And so I do that through, prior to being a student in the Kaivalya Yoga Method, I held space as a meditation and sound meditation teacher, creating spaces for folks to kind of journey within through sound. I do some strengths coaching as well. And then my full-time, that's me on the side, my full-time job is I work in higher ed and student affairs at Morehouse College as director for student leadership. So personal development is a big part of the work that I do. And that's kind of continued after completing the 200-hour with yoga as well, as one of those tools and modalities to help folks continue to do some internal work, turning that lens inward to be able to now really dig a little deeper, dig under those layers and really figure out and look at who we really are as folks. And so I'm excited that I think this discussion falls right in line with that level of work as we approach a pretty heavy few weeks. That seems to be almost like a boiling point from situations that happened way back to Trayvon Martin to bringing us where we are now with Ahmaud Arbery, with Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, on top of the fact that we're in a global pandemic. So it's a powder keg right now, and I think it's great to have these conversations in these moments. Yeah.
It's amazing to have these conversations in these moments. And the timing is so wild and interesting, honestly, because I feel like with the pandemic, people are generally traumatized just because of the pandemic, shaking things up, making us look at how we live our lives, what we are changing now that perhaps we never actually needed before, adjusting to a new normal. And I think everybody's really raw from that anyway. And so to have this incredible emotional uprising that speaks to the equality and justice for all people, I think people are much more heightened and much more able actually to be aware of this because we are already sensitized because of the pandemic. I live in New York City, and I have very much had the feeling this week that my city is on fire. That everybody's talking about this, everybody's raw. It's a different feeling even just walking down the street. I mean, it has been for the last few months because everybody's walking with masks, but now I feel like there's a little more kindness and openness in the eyes of the people that I walk by. Like, am I looking at an ally or am I looking at an enemy? And I think, hopefully in New York, we're a bit more allied. I would like to think that we are. But I want to discuss with you, Shawn. First of all, I want to discuss so many things. We're not going to solve all of the issues today, but how do we as yoga teachers and spiritual leaders and practitioners, how do we become good allies? How do we become good and appropriate supporters of this movement? What are some of the things that we could do?
Yeah, and so let me just say this too. A lot of my work is in leadership as well. And so one of the things that drew me to this program in particular is that, you know, you cornered it as yoga teachers are spiritual leaders, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so when we think about that, leadership is a difficult process quite often.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that in these times of difficulty, not shying away from the discomfort.
Absolutely.
I think that you know, when we think about where the country is at the moment, and you know, we rolled into the current situation we're in from a pandemic where folks are laid off. Well, everyone is, like you said, tender and raw at the moment, and then we have, you know, piling on top of this these racial issues around power dynamics, around police brutality. And so when we think about this, understanding that we're all coming from different perspectives, we have to lean into the discomfort and listen. I think that's one of the very important pieces, that it can get easy to want to just kind of retract into your own bubble and into your own experience.
Yes.
But this is the time in which we need folks, you know, whether we're looking at an issue around, you know, racial identity, whether we're looking at an issue around sexual orientation and gender identity, folks that don't identify in those communities, we need those folks as allies to still pay attention in these moments. Yeah. It's really important, and we understand that it can be uncomfortable, right? To have to be at a place where you're facing maybe your own biases, your own implicit biases. We understand that racism is a construct, institutional racism, institutional, you know, systemic hate in particular ways. And so that will require folks to do the work. And in doing the work, it's taking a second to look at, you know, as a white person, what is your relationship to racism? What is your relationship, you know, as a man, what's my relationship to sexism? You know, when we're looking at it, what's our relationship to these constructs in our society? And then how can we start to work towards dismantling them from the lens in which we are working, right?
Absolutely. And this is a deeply spiritual practice. So this is really at the heart, at the core of yoga's true power. Yoga has the power to change us from the inside out, but that requires us to look within at our shadow. And many people in the spiritual community don't do this. They use spiritual practice, not even yoga, any kind of spiritual practice, to ignore and gloss over their BS, right? Which simultaneously stands for bullshit as well as belief system. You know, so many people in the spiritual community, it's called spiritual bypassing. That is an actual term that psychology uses. We recognize it as a term that people use the practices to affirm their BS, as opposed to looking at it and changing it. And that process is uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. And there's no part of yoga, that encourages or allows us to ignore or deny the shadow. There is no place in yoga for any of us to ever say, I don't need to change, or I don't need fixing. And I hear people sometimes say things like, well, I'm not racist, or I'm not privileged. And it's actually like, yeah, you are. And when you start to look at that, you start to realize, as you say, some of the endemic social constructs that unless we examine it, we don't even know that we're a part of it. And we are a part of it. And this is, I'll be vulnerable here, Shawn. This is something that I struggle with. I am a white woman, and I have done my very best to take a look at some of the privileges that I have been saddled with as a result of being a part of this culture. And looking at that over the last few years has been a very interesting and painful process, but such a necessary process. And I remember when I first started learning and teaching yoga over 20 years ago, one of the incredible pieces of advice that I received from my teacher was to lean into the sharp edges. That's where the yoga occurs, that you lean into the sharp edges. And this isn't just that cute, quippy advice that we give to students, like, you know, go to the edge of your comfort zone, or like stretch just a little bit more. I mean, that's a great metaphor for doing the inner work, but it's not the inner work. leaning against the sharp edges is how we know we're actually allowing yoga to do its job, which is to create profound and powerful change.
Mm-hmm. And I think even to your metaphor, you know, if we're really examining ourselves in our practice, those should be some of the areas that we are realizing, right? So even in asana practice, if I realize that as I'm trying to come into warrior 3, I'm not giving myself grace in that, how does that translate off of the mat, right?
Yeah.
Or am I leaning into the discomfort? Or am I running away from the asana? That
Yeah.
translates off the mat, right? And that, you know, when things get difficult, are you turning away? Are you putting your head in the sand? Or
Yeah.
are you leaning into that discomfort and working through it? And so if we really take our practices that we're doing, even thinking about folks that are engaged in sitting meditation, right? Like if you take a second, you sit on your mat and you're getting into your meditation practice and you realize that you are like resistant to that, like what is that resistance? Because if
Right.
you can work through it in these practices, it should give you the courage to be able to work through it in real life. And so if we keep that alignment with what these practices are designed for, then we should be primed to do the work. We should be primed
Absolutely.
to do the work. Mm-hmm.
One of the things I learned, and it was under a very strange circumstance. I was on a trip to a foreign country, and there was an issue with my passport, and the people, weren't going to let me into this country. And I needed to go there because I was being hired to teach. And it turns out, that the official was saying to me, and I won't say the name of this country because it's controversial, but the official was saying to me, like, we're not supposed to let you in, and I'm a very honorable person, and, we have to send you back. And I was traveling with a friend who said, you know what, this is a moment for the spirit of, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, I don't want to make it sound flippant or trite, the spirit of Ganesh, right? That Ganesh is the remover of obstacles. And within that power, it is the obstacle itself that reveals the solution. So as this person was telling me, I'm so honorable, I have a family, this is my job, he's also telling me that, I need to basically pay him a bribe in order to get through. Like, and I said, well, of course you're honorable, you're incredibly, let me honor you by giving you a gift, right? We won't call it right, we'll call it something else. So it was this very complicated situation that in that moment, and this was years ago, presented something to me that was uncomfortable, it was difficult. And I had an opportunity to work with this problem and see the problem as holding the solution. Now, when I talk about Ganesh, and anytime I talk about deities in terms of yoga, they're not out there, right? There's no Ganesh out there. Ganesh is not going to come waltzing into our space here today and blast away the rock. That's not how it works. What it is a part of us, an essential part of us that knows how to solve problems. And when we ask for help, we have the ability, we empower ourselves to solve the problems, but it means that we have to actually look at the problem. We have to face the problem. We have to see the thing that is causing the discomfort, that is causing the challenge. And we have to do it with a bit of a different perception and a bit more of an open mind than we might in, our regular everyday normal lives where everything is going smoothly. So with that, what I would love to ask you is, with this, you said earlier that this is a powder keg moment. This is a boiling point. Racism in this country, this did not start yesterday. This problem has been a problem for hundreds of years. It's just that we've had these incidents that have built up over the last few, say, months in succession. We have been paying attention because they have been filmed, thankfully. Our eyes have to be on them. And we're a little bit more raw from this pandemic. We have this problem in front of us. How do we see an evolution, or what I might boldly call some kind of solution from within this problem? If we can be present, if we can look at it, what do we do?
I think it's complicated, right? But what I would say to that is, how can you lean into the work that is, again, authentic from your perspective, right? And so one of the things that I'm a practicing Buddhist, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I practice at the Atlanta Shambhala Center. And one of the things that I love about the work that happens there is that they create the intentional space for continued discussion, right? And I think that what tends to happen is, we have these incidents that occur, the loss of life. It happens, people get riled up, and then, a few months later, something else happens. The news media turns the attention somewhere else, and we're on to something different.
Right.
I think we have to, in these instances, utilizing them to create some structural changes and differences. And again, that might, on a larger level, we know there are laws that need to change. There's politicians we need to hold accountable, all of that good stuff. But on the level and the work that we're in is, how do we create those spaces in the spaces that we're in, right? And so, for example, at the Shambhala Center, they created a particular space for people of color to have specific meetings to talk about the work that needs to happen, providing safe space in that way. Conversely, there is an alternate group that meets that talks about and examines white privilege, right? And so they are creating space, and that's been something that's been in the works for the Shambhala Center since I've been in Atlanta, and that's about 5 or 6 years. So to see that and see those spaces, and then there's space for everyone to come together after we've had these different conversations to then work towards, a change in the work that we're doing. And so
that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it's important that we take time to do the work in our communities, because there are conversations that I think, as a white woman that you can have that has a different impact with other white folks than having someone else come and have that conversation. Now, again, that conversation happens together at a certain point, but there is space for those conversations and folks to hold our own communities accountable for how we move through and with this work. And so it's creating those systems, creating something structural, creating something that is occurring not just when we have these major issues in our country, but that happen consistently, so that we have those reminders, we have that consistent work. And it can be something as simple as, let's do a book club to read Skills in Action or White Fragility, right? Or there's different ways to do that. I think we should do that.
I'm like, ding, 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 light bulbs going off. Like, we could totally do that.
but there are things that we can do. And I know sometimes, and I can say for myself, even in the last few weeks, I had been hit with the feeling of like, wow, what can I do, right? Like, we get into these spaces where we feel like the situation is so overwhelming. It's a lot of, it is a lot of work to examine that and then figure out, even once you've done the self-examining, how do you step out into the world to try to make some change? And I would say, start from your circle and start to slowly move out, right? That if everyone is having these conversations with their family, with their friends, with the folks, in their yoga class, right? Like, are you leading your class around a particular topic that relates back to this work, right? It's taking those smaller steps that all start to add up to a larger level of change, because again, we're starting to keep the conversation strung together in a way that is at the forefront of all of our minds.
Absolutely. I talk often. I mean, sometimes I feel like a broken record, but I'll never stop saying it, that we are more than just yoga teachers. We are spiritual leaders. And I compare it essentially to being a modern day clergy member. So prior to 150 years ago or so, before the Industrial Revolution, people who lived in communities often had the same spiritual or religious belief system. And the role of the clergy member in that spiritual or religious belief system was to hold space, to usher change, whether it be for individuals or in a group as a collective, like weddings and funerals, to answer questions that seem unanswerable. What are we doing here? What's our life's purpose? With the Industrial Revolution, our attachment to cohesive spiritual and religious communities has actually declined greatly. But our need for the support system and structure that a clergy member would have provided has not gone away. And people, because yoga is spiritual, even though people may or may not, they may participate in varying degrees of the spirituality of yoga, they are attracted to that for some reason. I mean, there's a reason why people do yoga as opposed to any other kind of, let's call it, physical discipline. Asana, let's be honest, is not that great of a workout. I know that feels like it's blasphemous, but you can't do your sun salutations fast enough to ever get enough cardio. There's a lot of muscle groups you're missing. So it's not about the workout, it's about something else. And by proxy, when students have issues, and anyone who's been teaching for any length of time will recognize this, students come to us with questions that are not about the alignment of their knee over their ankle. They come to us with questions about, what do I do about my relationship? How do I handle this current situation? What's the best thing for me to do? How do I examine my sharp edges? How do I implement this philosophy? What does yoga have to say about social justice? Those are the kinds of questions that are coming our way. I mean, we saw it evidence this week inside of our teacher training group, right? There was this major calling of like, what do we do here? And this is something that as a yoga teacher, we need to be able to support. We need to be able to hold the space. And I think, rather than make us feel more overwhelmed as yoga teachers and spiritual leaders about what do I do? How do I get this right? I think at the most fundamental level, and Shawn, I hope you'll let me know if you agree or not with this, one of our most powerful things that we can do as spiritual leaders is to hold space, is to not ignore what's happening, is to not, I do want to say to take sides. I believe that when something is right and in alignment with the values of kindness, justice, equality, obviously we have to be on the side that champions love. But holding space sometimes also means holding space for the opposite side, to have a voice, to have a say, to have discussion where it is frank and open and people are unafraid to speak. And the job of holding space can be a big job. It can be a big job to be sort of the wall against which, the waves of this break. So I think that that's one of our biggest and most basic responsibilities as yoga teachers. I think there's certainly more that we can do, but what do you think about that?
Sure. I think holding space, I think, is a really important concept that I don't think can ever be driven home any further, right? That it's important. And I think really examining what it means to hold space. And so I think one of the biggest lessons that I think I've taken away from holding space for folks is like making sure that you've done your work so that you're prepared for whatever comes to you when you have that. Because as you mentioned, as a yoga teacher, no one's coming to say, hey, is my alignment great in in triangle pose? They're coming to say, hey, in this practice, such and such came up for me. What the hell does this mean? Right. And I've had that a lot, right? And I'm like, okay. And so taking the time to do the work for yourself, processing how this situation in particular for folks who are teaching, whether virtual or whether in person, because I know various parts of the country are starting to open up, that do the work yourself, understand where you fall in this work and where you fall around what is happening. And then also don't always feel the need to interject how you feel in a situation when you're holding space for folks.
Right. It's not. That's not your place.
That's not your place, and it's one of the lessons in coaching is that it's not always about us giving you the answers, right? Coaches don't always come and say, here's the whole playbook. Sometimes it is, I just need to hear what you have to say, and letting the person come to their own conclusion in a particular way. And so thinking about that. Another thing that I would say is really important in these spaces is when we think about marginalized communities and their voices right now, don't put the pressure on someone in a marginalized community to need to explain fully how they are feeling at the moment.
That's right.
I think that sometimes that can be unfair when we're in situations where, as a Black person, I'm coming into a space and it's like, well, how are you feeling about this? And what do you think and where you fall? It's like kind of like, I'm not sure if I want to share that. And it's not my job to educate you on why all of this is a problem at the moment. Same thing with folks who, trans folks, with folks in the LGBTQIA community. It's not their job to explain, why we are in these spaces. It's your job to educate yourself and then bring it to the table for a discussion and conversation, right? And so, again, that kind of goes back to just doing the work yourself so that you are prepared for what is going to come, the questions that you can properly hold space no matter who your class is serving. I think it's important too, as you mentioned, listening to all sides and listening to how folks are feeling. But what I would say to that, and as a bit of a challenge, is a challenge to folks in that, right? So when we have folks who are we're holding space for, how do we challenge folks to look back at the work, right? So if we have someone that comes and talks to us, and I can say I've had this as an example, someone's like, I just don't, I took the class, a lot was coming up for me, maybe some of the things that were coming up for me was around the protest, and I just don't get it. I don't understand what's happening. It's frustrating. Part of that for me is like, yes, hold space, let them talk, get it out, share how you feel. But for me, it's also a redirect that now that you've had those feelings, what can you do to work through and with that?
We can't let people off the hook from doing the work.
Yes.
I mean, part of a spiritual leadership role, you're totally right. It's not, we have to hold the space, but it's also a facilitation of spiritual evolution, right? It's not just a dead space. It's an active space, asking the right questions, encouraging people to lean against their sharp edges. And I love what you said. I mean, we can only lead people as far as we ourselves have gone. So we have to resolve it within ourselves first. That's where the most important work is done. And I absolutely agree with you that we cannot work our shit out with everybody else that we're trying to lead. So I talk about this a lot, actually, in terms of posting on social media, right? Just to kind of bring it into a relatable thing that people have dealt with before and something that I teach about. A lot of times as yoga teachers, as spiritual leaders, we forget that social media it's a professional platform for most of us. And when we're trying to go through something emotionally on social media, essentially what you're doing is you're asking your student to participate with you emotionally in working that thing out. So if you're complaining about, whatever is going on in your life and you're posting, you're airing your emotional business out on social media, it disrupts the boundary that we have between teacher and student. So when we're working with students, as a spiritual leader or a yoga teacher, the type of boundary that we hold is the same type of boundary as a professor and a student, or a mental health, therapist and a client, or a doctor and a patient. If there is a professional boundary there, and just like you wouldn't want to necessarily go to therapy and say, oh my gosh, I'm having a terrible day. And the therapist looks at you and go, oh my God, me too. It's like the worst day ever, right? Your therapist is there to hold the space for you to have a terrible day and allow you to move through it. While even if the therapist is having a terrible day, they get to work that out with their peers, their professional level peers. So, I think that that's a good thing to keep in mind for us as spiritual leaders. What do you think about that?
I think that, I think there's a balance to that. I think that, and I think this gets into, I know clearly having just recently done it, module 3, this conversation around, how are you branding yourself and the work that you're doing. I think that goes back to what type of teacher you are, and who your services are geared towards, right? Because I do think that there is value in us sharing how this work is affecting us, and part of that. But I do think that I agree that to a certain degree that there is a fine line to
we
walk.
Can definitely share. We can definitely share. We can definitely be personal. But when we share it as an anecdote after we've worked out the emotional piece, right? We're not sharing it as we're upset, because then essentially, people are empathetic. They want to recruit themselves into helping me or helping them. So it's like, look, I went through this. I did this. It affected me deeply. Here's what I did, and here's how that may help you. So everything that we do is a learning process.
Right. And so I definitely agree with you there. I think that it's harnessing our own experience in a way that we can then share it in a digestible way. And so, yes, I agree in there. And even to the degree of how we hold space in our class in particular, maybe there's a class themed around, and when I think back to, for myself, what this last 2 weeks has been, I was trying to figure out, what do I do? And in that, I was like, okay, so my class offerings for June are going to be centered around this whole idea of nourishment and reclaiming and pulling that in and letting that kind of structure the dynamic in which I'm going to hold space in that way. And so just thinking about that there are ways to still kind of share and be personable, but I agree, working it out prior to and then bringing it to the table of how and what that process looked like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Shawn, I am so grateful for your time today. Is there anything else you feel like we should talk about or discuss to, give our student or my students, your colleagues, our students, everybody around, everybody who wants to be a spiritual leader, especially at this time? Is there any other piece of advice or wisdom that you can offer them or share?
Sure. I think the main thing is this work is going to be discomfortable. Leadership work is
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
I like
It's all
discomfortable too.
uncomfortable. Yeah. It's uncomfortable work, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay to feel uncomfortable, but once you've felt uncomfortable and we've worked through our feelings, I want everyone just to think about is what's next, so
Mhm.
that we keep a level of momentum and action in the work that we're doing. That I feel uncomfortable, how do we work through it? Because I think when we come to those edges, when we come to that ability to notice that, hey, I'm uncomfortable for a reason, let me name this discomfort and figure out what I can do, that is where we are just primed for a level of change and growth, whether that's in ourselves or our community. And so I just challenge everyone in this time to just lean into the discomfort, understanding that folks, depending on what community they're in, have been feeling uncomfortable for a very long time, and use that as a motivation to make change. And understanding that that change can be with your family. Maybe you're having uncomfortable conversation
Mhm.
with a family member. Maybe it's how you hold space differently with yoga. Maybe it's changing the way you are navigating at work. But just understand that that change is just as important in the circles in which you're in, and let that lead how you are moving in the world. Because we just need, if everyone can do their part, then I think that level of change can happen, on a profound level.
I love that, and I'm all for it. So, Shawn, before we close out, we talked about how we as spiritual leaders can do our part individually and with our groups. We've talked about, um, hope. I mean, I'm just thinking of all the things that we can do, right? And I imagine that many people listening to this broadcast, they're perhaps protesting or doing things to help move this conversation forward. But I also want to ask you, if people want to donate money to a cause that's going to help move this conversation forward, where do you suggest we do that?
Sure. So for me, I've been funneling donations to Action Network. They're doing a lot of work. All of my classes for the month of June, all of the proceeds are going towards Action Network. And Action Network has been doing a lot of work to help bail out protesters who may have been illegally detained for any reason, and providing any legal services for folks who need it as they are practicing their First Amendment
Wonderful.
right to protest. So I think that, whether that is kind of your chart, I think there are tons of organizations to donate. Black Lives Matter is a really great one to donate
Mhm.
to. I know another one that is coming, that is gaining a lot of steam, is Eight Can't Wait, which is an organization or an initiative that is developing eight concrete changes that can happen in the criminal justice system, um, that can be put forward to legislators. And so there's a
Awesome.
lot of steam around that. If you look, I think it's the number 8 can't wait. It's a hashtag. You can
Okay.
find a lot of the information, and those are just some great places to start, in terms of donating.
Those are great places to start. And Shawn, where can people find you?
Sure, sure. So my website is ShawnJMoore.com, and social media, Shawn J underscore Moore.
And
Um,
you're an SHAWN, Shawn, correct?
yes, thank you. Thank you for that
You're
clarity.
welcome.
Yes,
And a more with an E
SHAWN.
at the end, Moore,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Moore. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, please follow me. I'm excited to just engage and talk with folks more about these kind of conversations. And so, again, if folks have questions, want additional resources, just want to chop it up, I'm open and available. Yeah.
Shawn, I am so, so grateful that you took the time to chat with me here today. And I'm very grateful that you are a part of High Value Yoga Method community. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us some great tips and advice and some thoughtful things to consider as we move forward into what is hopefully a much more peaceful, equal, and brighter future for everybody.
No, thank you. Thank you for opening up your platform and having this conversation. I appreciate you.
My absolute pleasure, for sure.